HNN Audio Story welcomes you. Today, I'm going to tell you a mysterious and chilling story about spirit board sessions, a ritual believed to connect us with the spiritual world. Is it truly a gateway to the unknown, or just a series of eerie coincidences? Let's dive in and find out. Pushpin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more stories. Part 1. Surely you have heard a lot about Ouija, right? The story below is not true or false because I did not participate. But I would like to tell you about my sister's story when she went to Ouija to ask for numbers. The story would be normal if it were not for the death of her friend and the impact on both her and her friend's family. 3 years ago, Ms. T was a senior student at the Foreign Trade University in Ho Chi Minh City. At that time, she was just a student and was very curious about spiritual matters. One day, her friend, Mr. Q, the deceased, invited her and a few people, including Mr. Q's younger sister, a first-year student at the same school, to go to Ouija to ask for numbers. She was not a lottery player, but because she was curious about this Ouija game, she agreed to go along to see what was true. That night, Mr. Q, Ms. T, Mr. Q's younger sister, and two of their friends went deep into the riverside area in District 2. The group sat near the riverbank deep inside. The road was not accessible for vehicles, so they had to walk to get in. When they reached a place they liked, Mr. Q and his friends took out a small piece of wood that he said was cut from someone's coffin board. When asked where they got it, he didn't say. On the piece of wood were carved all the letters, from as 0 to 9, with the words ghost, devil, God, and saint evenly distributed in the four corners. When everything was ready, he took out a small, old-looking coin and placed it in the middle of the piece of wood. The four people who played at first were Mr. Q, his younger sister, and two friends. Only Ms. T sat and watched because she didn't know how to reach back to see. When the incense was stuck in the ground, Mr. Q started to light the stick quickly and then read the spell that Ms. T remembered, which had the sentence, or floating in the air, whose soul is wandering around here. Ms. T said it was too long. She couldn't remember clearly, but after reading it, she felt creepy. After reading the spell, they put their fingers on the coin. The four people sat still and read the coin. For a long time they didn't see anything. Mr. Q read the spell again about 2 to 3 times. Then the stick suddenly moved and the coin shook. The coin suddenly ran around the wooden board. The four people put their fingers on it and also shook but tried to stay still. Ms. T sat outside, not knowing if it was real or not. She also lowered her head to watch. Mr. Q then asked, "Is it a god or a devil?" The coin spun around for a while and then pulled back to the word, ghost. Mr. Q continued to ask a few questions like how long has it been since it's been dead, why it died, and then asked a bunch of other things. Ms. T sat watching, not knowing whether she should believe it or not, but feeling a bit creepy. The darkness around also made people's skin crawl. After talking for a long time, when they got a number, Mr. Q and a few others pushed the coin to the top and wished the ghost. The others sitting there were also interested and said to play more. Now Ms. T said to just play for a try. Mr. Q's younger sister went outside to let Ms. T sit down. When Ms. T read the spell about 3 or 4 times and nothing happened. She thought that these people must have colluded to tease her. Just as she was about to say that Mr. Q was playing strangely, the coin suddenly shook violently. She only felt a cold air from the coin running through her body. Giving her goosebumps, the coin spun very fast on the wooden board. She asked tremblingly, "Is it a god or a devil?" The coin suddenly stopped. Then it was as if her finger was stuck to the coin. Slowly pulled away and stopped right at the word devil. At this moment, Mr. Q panicked and threw the entire Ouija board up, because meeting a devil was not good. But his mistake was not pushing the word thing, but tossing it up was an extremely bad thing. Mr. Q shouted, ran quickly to the car and could not stay here anymore. The whole group quickly stood up and ran when they heard behind the Ouija board. When it was on the wooden board, the coin flew up and knocked on the wooden board, accompanied by a series of giggles. He that made their bodies shiver. The whole group ran to the car and rushed to the car to drive away but realized that Mr. Q was missing. They shined the lights around and called his name but did not hear a response. The whole group was afraid that he had tripped and fallen when it was dark earlier. So the four of them walked close together and went in the same direction to look for him. After walking for a while, they saw a dark shadow standing right next to the tall grass near the riverbank. They were startled and turned their flashlights over to see Mr. Q standing there, his eyes lifeless, his face cold and emotionless. The people standing there calling out to him didn't get any response. They were about to run over when they heard rustling behind them. They turned around and heard laughter in the grass. They were startled and retreated. But the grass was silent again. They turned around to look for Mr. Q, who had disappeared a long time ago. At this point, everyone was so scared that they were shaking. They were both worried and didn't dare to continue looking. They were covered in sweat. They had no choice but to return to the car and call someone to go look for him. About half an hour later, friends and relatives came back and started to search. Some lit a fire. Others shined their flashlights and went in to search. When they got to the place where they had been playing the Ouija board, Ms. T stood trembling behind everyone when she saw the coin spinning around the Devil's Square while no one was sitting there. Everyone standing around was cold. Suddenly saw a shadow of Mr. Q in front. Went to see no one. Only saw a puddle of water on the ground. Everyone was terrified and ran to the riverbank to look for him. When they got there, Mr. Q's sister cried miserably when she saw Mr. Q lying right in the water. His body floating on the water near the bushes from earlier, bringing his body to the shore. Everyone was both scared and extremely sorry. His face was pale. His eyes were wide open as if he had seen something horrible. When Mr. Q's sister arrived, Mr. Q's eye sockets and ears were full of bright red blood. Everyone moved Mr. Q's body back at night. When getting in the car to go back, Ms. T heard someone calling her name in the wind. The voice was moaning, making her cold all over, hugging her friend tightly and crying, telling her to run faster. She didn't dare to turn back when she felt like someone put a cold hand close to the back of her head. She shivered and got goosebumps, crying, telling her friend to run faster. When they arrived at Mr. Q's house at night, everyone told his family everything. Everyone was angry and blamed him for daring to get involved with ghosts and demons, and for not knowing what to do to let this happen. But what had happened? They comforted them because they were also scared to death. Mr. Q was transferred home late at night. Sister T stayed with Brother Q's younger sister and the family to help. Standing next to the bed where Brother Q was lying, the white towel covering his face, she slowly reached out to remove it to see him one last time. When suddenly Brother Q's cold hand grabbed her and the towel suddenly popped off. Brother Q turned around and grinned at her in horror. Sister T was startled and looked back, realizing that she had been imagining it all this time. But feeling cold inside, she went to the front to sit with Brother Q's younger sister. Relatives started to set up a tent that night, in the room where the shaman was performing a ritual. Sister and Brother Q's younger sister sat in front. His younger sister cried until her eyes were swollen. Sister T could only sit and hold her in her arms to comfort her. Suddenly, she saw Brother Q standing outside the gate, soaked, his eyes wide open, looking at her. She stammered, Q, Q, Q. Hey, Q. It's standing out at the gate. There, M. After saying that, T's body turned cold and she fainted. When she woke up, Q's younger sister and Q's parents were sitting next to her. She smelled a strong smell of oil on her body. She must have thought she had a stroke, so they helped her in to massage her. She sat down and told everyone. But no one believed her because they thought she must be missing her friend because T and Q were close friends. Until Q's younger sister was bringing water to the guests when she heard someone calling her outside the gate. She ran out and was terrified when Q was standing there, covered in water, looking at her and saying, "I'm so cold, help me. I'm so cold." She threw away the teapot and ran, screaming until tears welled up in her eyes. Only then did everyone know that something had happened. If he died young and drowned, they feared that the family would be in trouble. They called the monks from the temple down to ask them to help the family. He threw the teapot and ran away screaming until tears came to his eyes. Only then did everyone know that something had happened. If he died young and drowned, they feared that the family would be in trouble. They called the monks from the temple down, and when he came down, they asked him to help the family. He threw the teapot and ran away screaming until tears came to his eyes. Only then did everyone know that something had happened. If he died young and drowned, they feared that the family would be in trouble. They called the monks from the temple down, and when he came down, they asked him to help the family. Part 2. After the girl was so frightened that she fainted, her brother Q took his car to the temple and asked the monk to come down and help. After everyone left, everyone started to gossip about the girl, because only the people in the house knew about the Ouija that led to Q's death. Some people said that if she died in a river or lake, they would be afraid to come back and drag her along, while others said that she was lured by a ghost and brought into the house. Everyone was scared. Some people left, and some stayed and did not dare to leave the gate. Sister T sat and talked about the time she saw Q until she encountered the strange things right on the riverbank. Everyone turned pale, thinking that they had encountered a drowning person who wanted to kill them. About an hour later, only her brother Q came back alone. Entering the house, Mr. Q sat down, his face serious. He had to take a sip of wine to tell the story. When he went to the temple, the monk said that Mr. Q had committed a big taboo when using the planchette, which was to flip the table so that the drowned woman could take Mr. Q's soul away. Mr. Q was led to the river to die when Ms. T and her friends ran away. When the sisters saw his soul, he tried to appear to tell them to run away, but they couldn't because he was controlled by that demon. The monk also said that he couldn't go down yet because he was praying for someone who had a traffic accident. He told everyone who was in the planchette to stay inside the house and not go out at night. Just take care of that first. Then leave a bowl of rice with chopsticks in it so that Mr. Q could eat without going hungry. After saying that, Mr. Q ran back, but when he ran back to near the gate, Mr. Q suddenly felt a chill down his spine, feeling something wet touching his neck. He turned around and saw nothing. Only the back seat was wet from somewhere. He pulled the throttle and ran straight in. When he got home, he was shaking and had to drink a glass of wine to sober up enough to tell everyone. Everyone shook their heads but had to do as the teacher said. The men stayed to watch over Q while the women and girls went to sleep. Sister T also helped the little girl upstairs to sleep, but the little girl was pitifully scared. She kept crying and shaking. Passing by Q's room, Sister T felt strangely cold and warm in that room. Normally, she often visited Q's room to play, but now she didn't dare to go in. The two sisters lay down and slept. Sister T hugged the little girl tightly to make her feel secure, because she cried so much. She also fell asleep and so did Sister T at around 2 a.m. She suddenly felt cold and the little girl's body kept shaking. She opened her eyes and was startled when the little girl stared at her. She lay back, but when she tried to tie her up, she noticed that her eyes weren't looking at her but at the window behind her. She felt cold and turned back to the window and saw a blurry shadow behind the window. She felt like it was a girl because she couldn't see clearly. But she was sure that her child had drowned because although it was blurry, her body was pale and wet. Suddenly, she laughed shrilly, as if it was right next to her ear. The giggle was so creepy that Ms. T was scared and screamed. The people downstairs heard the scream and ran up, only to see her trembling and pointing towards the window but couldn't see anything. At this moment, the child seemed to have awakened. She jumped in surprise and cried and begged, then curled up on the bed and cried forever. Everyone coaxed her until she calmed down and told the story. She was sleeping when she heard a knock on the door right next to the window. She looked out and saw a woman with wet clothes staring at her. She was so scared that she couldn't scream or close her eyes. Her whole body was stiff and she just stared out there. The drowned girl scratched at the door and said to her, "Don't you love your brother? Come out and play with your brother." Ha, ha, ha. She just stood there laughing and suddenly saw a glimpse of her brother with sad eyes standing next to that demon. After she finished telling the story, she cried again. Everyone had to stay and coax her, forgetting to notice Ms. T, who was sitting huddled in a corner. She had seen her since she was little, but never had she been as scared as now. She couldn't say a word, couldn't cry, and couldn't move. She just sat there, shaking until Mr. Q's mother came to ask her. Then she fell over and fainted. Mr. Q's mother had to rub her with oil to wake her up. That night no one could sleep. The whole family had to go downstairs to sit and pray. occasionally hearing crying outside the gate, the loud barking of dogs outside, every now and then, a few yelps from the dogs, as if they had encountered something terrifying. At 3 a.m., it was raining heavily. The whole family was sitting when suddenly they heard a crash upstairs. He and Mr. Q's father and a few people went up to see and were terrified when Mr. T's room's glass door was broken. Rain splashed inside, but the horrifying thing was the wooden Ouija board lying underneath the pile of broken, bloody glass. Next to it was mud with the bodies of several fish and a dog's head lying next to it. The fish were still struggling. The dog's head kept yawning, oozing out a black, foul-smelling substance. Everyone was terrified and didn't dare to go near it. Had to wait a while to calm down before cleaning up the mess and throwing it away. And brought the Ouija board downstairs and left it on the table so they could ask the shaman about it tomorrow. Everyone had a terrible night since Mr. Q died. The first night facing that drowned fish, it was raining heavily and the whole family was sitting when suddenly they heard a crash upstairs. He and Mr. Q's father and a few people went up to see and were terrified when Mr. T's room's glass door was broken and the rain splashed inside. But the horrifying thing was the wooden Ouija board lying underneath the pile of broken, bloody glass. Next to it was mud and several dead fish and a dog's head lying next to it. The fish were still struggling, and the dog's head kept yawning, oozing out a black, foul-smelling substance. Everyone was terrified and didn't dare to go near it. They had to wait a while to calm down before cleaning up the mess and throwing it away. They brought the Ouija board downstairs and left it on the table so they could ask the fortune teller about it tomorrow. Everyone had gone through a night of terror since Mr. Q died. The first night facing that drowned fish, it was raining heavily and the whole family was sitting when suddenly they heard a crash upstairs. He and Mr. Q's father and a few people went up to see and were terrified when Mr. T's room's glass door was broken and the rain splashed inside. But the horrifying thing was the wooden Ouija board lying underneath the pile of broken, bloody glass. Next to it was mud and several dead fish and a dog's head lying next to it. The fish were still struggling, and the dog's head kept yawning, oozing out a black, foul-smelling substance. Everyone was terrified and didn't dare to go near it. They had to wait a while to calm down before cleaning up the mess and throwing it away. They brought the Ouija board downstairs and left it on the table so they could ask the fortune teller about it tomorrow. Everyone had gone through a night of terror since Mr. Q died. The first night facing that drowned fish. Part 3. At 7 a.m., for some reason it was still gloomy outside. Drizzling rain, and occasionally the sound of a motorbike passing by could be heard outside the alley. Outside the gate, a figure was entering the house. As they approached, everyone was still confused, not knowing who it was. Because this person was wearing a brown-black al-ba-ba, with a high forehead, a thick beard, and sharp eyes under thick eyebrows, making his face look very fierce. Q's older brother from downstairs happily brought him in and introduced that this was his teacher. At this point, everyone was less curious, but still a bit scared of the teacher's fierce face. According to what was known, the teacher used to be a very good magician with a beautiful wife and smart children. But once when he exorcised a family in the north, he used forbidden magic and the whole family was beaten, losing both his wife and children. So he decided to go to the temple to do good deeds but did not become a monk. At this time, the teacher sat down, looked around at everyone, then stared at T and Q's younger sister. These two children must be kept carefully. Otherwise, if they follow the boy, they will be ruined. Q's mother was shocked when she heard the teacher's words. So what should we do now? Teacher? Her worried, wet eyes made everyone feel sympathy. That drowned child died when he was young, but he carried a great hatred in his heart, and was not buried properly. Only a grave was made near the river bank. So now we have to find the place where he was buried and pray in the hope that these two will be forgiven. The boy will be released to return to the underworld, but he will not serve him there and harm others. The teacher was silent for a moment, then continued, but because he wants someone to be by his side to serve him, he should ask first. If not, I will think about it later. The whole family was silent. Then Mr. Q's father spoke up. So what time can we make the offering? And how can we find its place? I'll do that, but only these two, Ms. T and the girl, will go with us. We'll go tonight. I've already left the offerings in the basket. The teacher stared at Ms. T again, making her feel embarrassed and scared. Then the teacher stood up, walked to Q's coffin, made a seal on Q's chest, then took the egg from the offering bowl and put it in Q's mouth. From his mouth, black mud oozed out, stinking terribly. His face that had been purple and black turned pale. Everyone gathered around and asked the teacher why he did that, but he only replied that he did it for Q's good, without explaining anything further. Seeing that, no one dared to ask any more questions. While they were standing and talking, Q's brother came over to show the teacher the Ouija board and told him about last night. The teacher told him to burn the board, then go to Q's room to get charms to stick on the glass windows. Then clean the room, put an incense burner in the middle of the room, and then go down. People often say the stupidest thing is to bring all the bad things into yourself. How could these kids be so foolish as to take the wood from someone else's coffin lid instead of the wood from the coffin lid? Why is that, teacher? Sister T now dared to ask. What about the stars and the moon? The coffin lid of the dead is like a door to the underworld. It is the entrance and exit of the dead and the living world. You guys took the wood from there as if you were opening the door for ghosts and demons to come in and out. So do you think that night there was no one around you? They were all standing around you? Sister T now suddenly remembered why she felt cold when the players were playing. And also when someone's hand tried to touch her heel. Thinking back, she shivered. Then the teacher told her to burn this table. Leaving it in the house would only add to the trouble. Brother Q just brought it out to burn. When it was burning, it smelled like burnt meat. While it was burning, you could hear a hissing sound like something was wrong. It was creepy. At about 11:30, the teacher stood up, picked up his bag and said it was time to go, and that they could go out now. Sister T and the girl stood up, and she was startled when she looked out the gate and saw Q with a pale face looking at her. His cold, soulless eyes making her sweat and her legs tremble. The teacher then walked over and said it wasn't Q was in the river. These were ghosts disguised to lure and hide people. Just calmly walk out and pretend you didn't see them. Sister T trembled as she walked out with the girl. Passing by Q's figure, she pursed her lips tightly as his head slowly turned to follow her footsteps. He kept whispering and calling Sister T's name. Her face turned purple. After getting in the car, she breathed a sigh of relief and turned back to see if he had left. But she was shocked to see him standing next to the car door. She bit her lips and trembled as she turned back and forth pretending she didn't see him. Ghosts are just like us. Humans have been living with ghosts for a long time now. Only if you have a negative fate can you see them. Not everyone who wants to can. That's why many evil spirits take advantage of it to do bad things like this one. So just act normal and you will be fine. The teacher spoke gently to calm her down before signaling the driver to go to the riverbank. When they got there, it was almost 1 a.m. The three of them walked inside. Suddenly, the teacher took out 3 incense sticks, mumbled a prayer, then stuck them in a nearby bush, and added a handful of rice in his hand. Hearing the teacher say it was to offer to the wandering souls so they could find them. Sister T was terrified when she heard that. How could the teacher communicate with ghosts like a normal person and speak all those languages? She stood silently, holding the girl's hand tightly to ease her fear. How could I not be scared when returning to this horrible place? She looked over and saw the girl's eyes were swollen and she kept looking around. Her psychology must have been heavily affected since losing her brother and meeting the ghosts. Everyone would be like that. While she was standing there, thinking vaguely, the teacher spoke up and told her to go inside the bushes near the riverbank. When she got there, she saw a small mound of earth rising from under the bushes, with sparse grass growing on top. She was startled when she saw a clump of human hair on top of the mound. She panicked and stepped back behind the girl, but realized there was nothing there. It must have been an illusion. Swish, swish, swish. The sound startled Ms. T and the girl when it came from behind them. Part 4. Rustle. The sound rang out again. Both of them startled and turned back. From behind in the swaying grass, the two of them unconsciously retreated towards the teacher. A black cat jumped out from somewhere, hissed, and then left. Sister T was startled but also breathed a sigh of relief because it was just a cat. Turning back to the teacher, She saw that he had already prepared all his things and was lighting incense. Sitting and mumbling something. After a while, a wind blew from somewhere. Not too strong but enough to make the nearby trees and grass sway and rustle. The teacher read louder and louder, shaking the rosary in his hand and sitting and reading louder and louder sentences that she didn't understand. Suddenly she felt cold, turned to the girl and saw her eyes wide open, staring at the bushes behind the mound of earth. Let's call it a grave. Her mouth was trembling as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. She grabbed her hand so tightly that her skin would peel off. She turned around tremblingly and stammered in panic, "Teacher, teacher." She couldn't say anything because behind the grave, there was a dark figure sitting curled up in there, its lifeless eyes looking out towards her and the little girl. She wanted to take the little girl and run towards the teacher, but her legs wouldn't listen to her. They were shaking and she couldn't say anything, as if something was blocking her throat. She was so scared that tears welled up in her eyes and she stuttered and called out to the teacher in a small voice. "Stay there. That Q guy is fine. I've been calling him for a long time, but this drowned kid won't come up. Let me talk to Q." When she heard that, even though she knew it was Q, she couldn't hide her fear when the dark shadow sat curled up in the bushes. But its eyes had no emotions at all. It just looked at her lifelessly, giving her a gloomy feeling, making her goosebumps. The two of them almost got a little closer to the teacher, sat down on the ground, mumbled prayers and hugged each other tightly. Suddenly she felt a chill behind her back, as if something was approaching her. Like the sensitivity of humans when something dangerous is approaching. It feels chilly somehow. She was slowly turning her head when a wet but cold hand touched her hand. "Ah!" she screamed in horror, making both the teacher and the girl jump. Turning around, she couldn't see anyone, but a cold laughter echoed around, making everyone shiver. "Can you talk to me for a moment?" the teacher spoke. The only response to his words was the whistling wind accompanied by echoing laughter. Although the weather in Saigon was hot, why did she feel cold all over now? Her heart kept beating after each laugh. She stared at Mr. Q, but he was no longer there. Sitting there, trembling, her eyes darting around in that extreme fear. She didn't notice that the little girl's hand had gotten colder. Suddenly it convulsed violently and groaned. Its face that was scared just now looked pale. Its lifeless eyes stared at her, then looked at the teacher. She was rooted to the spot. Wanted to step back but couldn't. Could only close her eyes and cry. "Teacher, I'm so cold," the little girl's voice spoke, but it sounded different. Hoarse and dull. That's right. This was Mr. Q's voice. She cried loudly and grabbed the little girl's, Mr. Q's, hand. "Help me call that girl up here. I will help you return to your family." The teacher calmly replied. He still looked the same, showing no signs of fear or trembling in the face of such strange things. "It wants me to catch my brother with me. Teacher, help me, I'm so cold." Saying that, the little girl hugged herself tightly, trembling. "Tell her to spare us. I'll send a mannequin down to replace them, and build a tomb for her so she can have a warm place." The teacher tried to persuade her. Suddenly, from the mound of earth, a soft, but still frightening moaning sound came from the mound, making anyone who heard it faint with fear. This was the second time Ms. T had seen her with her own eyes. That horrifying drowning child. Half of her face looked like it had lost all flesh, leaving only bones. Her wet hair was hanging down and sticking to her horrifying face. Her eyes were always wide open without blinking. Her head kept shaking, looking back and forth, then smiling. At that moment, she suddenly raised her hand and slowly pointed at Ms. T and the little girl without saying anything. "No, no, no." Mr. Q's voice in the little girl's body made her heart skip a beat. Even though she knew Mr. Q was her friend, every time he spoke, she got goosebumps because his voice did not come from his mouth but echoed like a person speaking. "Do you know that it will be difficult for you to be liberated if you keep doing that? I will hold a ceremony to offer offerings to the river god for you." Only then did the teacher speak in a harsh voice. He dead, he died. Ttt, he. The child laughed coldly and spoke unclearly, then jerked his head and looked at Ms. T. She felt a cold wave running through her body. Someone seemed to hold her hand and pull her over. She walked lifelessly towards the mound of earth. She tried to struggle, but her body no longer felt like it belonged to her. The teacher stood up, grabbed her hand and pulled her down, then mumbled and pressed the beads on her hand. The drowned child screamed loudly, "Ah, ah," and disappeared. The girl had been lying there for a while now. Her lips were purple. The teacher went over and took a small red piece of paper, opened her mouth to close it, then went to Ms. T. She still hadn't recovered. Her eyes were still confused after what had just happened. "So miserable. I had to use force to stop it," the teacher said spitefully. Part 5. I will explain now so that many of you wonder why out of the 4 players at that time, only Ms. T and Mr. Q's younger sister were affected like this. Because according to the teacher, Ms. T and the girl were compatible with the drowned girl, so she wanted to catch her down. But the other 2 were not compatible, so she did not catch her. Mr. Q was affected because he threw the chessboard, so that important mistake led to his death. Why was Mr. Q tormented by the drowned girl but did not dare to say anything because it was just like our society? Mr. Q was just a normal ghost. It was a demon, especially because it had been dead for a long time, so ghosts could not ask for anything. Back to that moment, the loud explosion made both Ms. T and the driver terrified. The 2 of them hurriedly ran inside to see what was going on. The moment that touched all of her senses was not like what she imagined. Something terrible had happened. All there was a quiet space without a trace of wind. Terrifyingly silent. The driver slowly drove to the riverbank, only to see a pile of black, stinking slime left on the edge of the riverbank. She trembled as she approached him, almost vomiting when the smell hit her nose. So where was that explosion? Where is the teacher? While the questions were in her head, she faintly heard someone calling her name, turning around and around but couldn't see anyone. But the voice kept ringing in her ears, whispering, but she heard her name very clearly. "Did you hear anything?" she asked. The driver looked around blankly, not understanding what was going on, but suddenly he felt a chill down his spine as if someone had just touched him. He jumped to one side in surprise and looked around. There was no one, making his skin crawl. Sister T kept wondering and looking around for the teacher. Then she stopped and crossed the small path leading to that mound of dirt. Brother Q's shadow appeared and disappeared over there. He seemed to smile at her. The smile was not a ghostly one that scared her. The smile of a friend who was once very familiar to her. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. She unintentionally walked towards him as if there was a force pulling her towards him. The driver was startled when he saw her walking absent-mindedly while it was dark ahead. He ran to pull her back, calling her, but she still walked towards him as if nothing had happened. As soon as she left, tears kept flowing down. Her mouth stuttered, calling Q's name. He just stood there silently looking at her and then slowly faded away. She quickly ran to call him, looking for him in that pitch-black darkness, but the only response she got was the cold wind blowing past. She sobbed. The feeling of fear that she had just felt a moment ago had disappeared, leaving only a feeling of pity for him, for the teacher. "Ah, teacher, teacher?" the driver shouted when he saw a dark figure lying on the mound of dirt. Both of them ran over. The teacher was still normal, but from his nose, fresh red blood was drying there. He shook the teacher awake, both worried and scared, calling for him. Ms. T also quickly came to massage the teacher's hands and feet, then saw a book fall out of her bag. She opened it, and inside were all scribbled words that couldn't be identified. She turned to a page covered in blood, 2 faded photos. She thought these must be the teacher's wife and children. No wonder he cried at the riverbank. At the moment when her hand was about to turn the next page, a cold wind blew past her, making her shiver. Before she could turn the next page, a dry hand grabbed her hand. Don't flip it open. Close the book, right now," the teacher whispered, making her startled and quickly close the book. She turned to look at the teacher. His face had turned pale. He coughed so much that she thought his chest would burst. "It's done. I've suppressed it. Cough, cough. Let's go home." The driver helped the teacher stand up and walk out of the car. "What happened just now, teacher? Why did I hear an explosion?" She worriedly walked beside him and asked repeatedly. But the teacher didn't answer. She raised her hand to signal her to stop asking. She turned back to look at that place once and saw Mr. Q's figure smiling at her, slowly fading away. At that moment, she seemed to hear his voice. "Thank you, T." She burst into tears, heartbroken just because of her curiosity. She had lost a close friend. Everything in the family returned to normal. She also returned to school. And Q's younger sister was allowed by her family to go back to her hometown in Nha Trang to relax and forget about the past events. About a month later, she went to the temple to visit her teacher and heard from the monks that he had passed away a week before. Before he passed away, he had handed over a book to the temple, which he had sealed with a talisman and asked the temple to keep. Absolutely not to open it. She regretted not visiting her teacher sooner but hoped that he would reach the Buddha's land. Occasionally, she saw Q. He told her that he was sent by his grandparents there to study and became a small official there, and lived a good life. So he often told her many things that she was still scared to tell me. I told this story as I said from the beginning. According to her story, I cannot verify the truth of it all. But anyway, it has taught us a lesson. Never use the story of ghosts and demons as a game. They're just like us. If people don't offend the devil won't offend people. Don't let a few rash actions make me regret it too late. He. I'm going back to my grave now. He.